Hi, this is DarkFox127 and welcome to another Scrum Creation Kit tutorial video. Today we're going to be going over factions. So I will tell you all about how factions work, what they do, although to be perfectly honest with you, I don't know absolutely everything about them and entirely how they work, but I'll tell you what I know. Now when we talk about factions, people think that it's just to get bands of NPCs together, so you'd have, say, Stormcloaks and Imperials, and they know to want to kill each other. Or it might get companions to hate the giants, so that they'll go out and hunt those, or get giants to be generally friendly with players, or things like that. Now, factions do a lot more than that. As you'll know from watching things like merchant tutorials, follower tutorials, you can go and watch my own, I'll leave the links in the description. You'll know that we are adding factions to our NPCs, which are related to things like merchant chests, or specific job types, or getting somebody to follow. So factions do a lot more than just put you in a group. They can also dictate dialogue. So if, for an example, we were creating a merchant and we decided to add the dialogue for spells, for selling spells, then you should see in the job factions here, there would be something related to spells, or there we go, job spell faction. Now this, if you double click on it, you'll see that there are a number of NPCs in the list, which will be the game's default spell sellers. And although you can't see it, this is linked to dialogue. This will actually add dialogue to them, which means that when they sell you an item, they would say something along the lines of, check out all the spells that I've got. I can't think what the dialogue is off the top of my head, but they will say something relevant to spells rather than say like check out my wares. It'll be check out the different spells I've got, or I've got some new spells, whatever. So it does a lot more than that. So when you're adding factions in, you might not just be placing them in a group. You might notice that the NPC that you've added the faction to also receives certain dialogue. So you can either, that can either be a good thing or it could be a bad thing. So you could create an NPC and you could notice that they're talking guard dialogue when they're meant to be just a villager, and that could be because you've added the guard dialogue faction in. So not all the factions, although some do state when they are linked with dialogue. So guard dialogue faction there, you'll see that there's a whole load of guards in the list. That makes them talk like guards, basically. It gives them that sort of dialogue so that they're not walking around dressed as a guard, acting like a guard, but not speaking like a guard. So yeah, factions have a link to dialogue as well, although we can't see it in the kit. There's certain things in the creation kit we just can't get access to, or they might even be linked deep within the quests somewhere. So the other thing that factions do, as you would expect, is get factions to attack each other or be friendly with each other. You can also set things like ranks, although I don't think that's really used in Skyrim, although it is part of sort of the engine, the creation kit. Crimes is another thing. Whenever you are committing a crime and you get caught by a guard and you're sent to prison, you'll notice that you're sent to a specific location and you'll think, oh, that's just cool. Anyone would think that's just what the game does. But you'll notice that if you're in Falkreath, you'll go to an area in Falkreath. If you're in Whiterun, it'll send you to sort of Dragon's Reach, the jail just outside there. And that's because of factions. There are crime factions which you can add to your player, which do two things. One is it could set up where you're going to be sent to prison for a specific area. So if you made your own place, you could make a faction for it, a crime faction, which I might do a video on eventually. The other thing it does is it gets NPCs to react correctly. So when you commit a crime in somebody's house and that NPC is connected to a specific crime faction, they'll know which faction to report it to. So if they're in crime faction Falkreath, if we just go to a crime faction here, if an NPC's in crime faction Falkreath, then they will report the crime to here, and then through this faction it will know what to do with you. As you can see, it says like track crime, it'll remember details and things, it'll know where to send you and how to have guards react. So factions do all sorts of different things. In the way of followers, there is a follower faction, and that also works off sort of a little bool or variable that it tweaks, and you'll notice that when you create followers you have to set it to -1. That means that by default somebody isn't following you, but all that does is it makes sure that the NPC is in that faction, and when you communicate with them and you speak that specific dialogue to follow, then it flicks that to another number, probably 0 or 1, and that means that they're following you. So factions do an awful lot of different things, and the best thing to do with factions is go into them, take a look around, figure out what they do, what they're set up as. They might be for vendors, for merchants, for setting radiuses, knowing what times they're supposed to be, doing different things, selling you different things. There's a lot of different things that factions do. Now all I'm going to do is I'm going to alternate click and new, and I'm going to show you through how to create your own. It really depends on what you want to do. Your own faction, as I say, make a crime faction, vendor faction, ranks, general. I'm not going to go through make sort of vendor factions. You can check out my tutorials for that, for making merchants, things like that. But let's start with general. So hidden from PC, you'll probably use this a lot with things like vendor factions, and it's because you don't want them showing up in the statistics on your menu. It doesn't want to say like I'm part of selling stuff. You don't want that. So hide it from the menu. They'll be part of the faction, but it won't be anything that's acknowledged in game. Special combat isn't really used. I think there's certain aspects of this kit that just aren't used. Can be owner. This is useful when you want somebody to own this faction, or sorry, not own the faction. If you want the faction to be able to own something. So usually if you click on a double bed and you only want a specific person to sleep in it, you would select an NPC. But you can also do it in the case of a faction. So you could select this faction and say this faction owns that bed, meaning anybody in this faction can sleep in that bed. And to be able to have the faction do that, you would need to tick can be owner. So if ever you are trying to do that and you're saying why can't my faction be selected in the bed category or whatever, that'll be the reason. Now interfaction relations, alternate click and new, and you can select different factions which can be of different statuses to your own. So we could say ally, friend, neutral, enemy. As you would expect, this determines how they're going to react around these different factions that they are linked with. So you can add a whole load of them. Obviously I don't want to select companions 100 times. You've got your ID and name, pretty self-explanatory, know about that stuff. Ranks, that's not really used. I haven't seen it used in many factions. You can take a look around. It might be used in specific things like maybe the Dark Brotherhood. There's different levels, but I think this is more applicable to other games which use the same kit. Now crimes, you've got all sorts of nice settings. This is probably a really fun tab to play with. You've got tracking crime. This means it'll remember what you've done. So usually when you commit a crime and you run away and somebody's seen you, a witness maybe, it keeps track of your bounty in that specific area, and you would then link this crime to that location. So that's what tracking crime does. You've got exterior trail marker, follower wait marker, so that's where your follower's going to wait for you if there was a follower waiting for you when you got sent to this prison, this marker here. You've got stolen goods container, where it's going to put all your stuff basically, and you've got player inventory container, which is interesting. They're probably that might be something different. You can probably check that out in the Creation Kit wiki to explain everything, but there's all sorts of different options to play with. Jail outfit, what you want to be sort of put in when you go to jail, because it usually takes all your clothes off and replaces it with a jail outfit. You could have yourself wearing whatever you want really, but you probably just put ragged clothes. Then you've got these options down here. Crime gold, I would say that this is all to do with how much it's going to cost you. So if you pickpocket, the crime could be 10 gold, or it could be 100 because you're being nasty, or you just don't tolerate crimes that much. Murder could get you like 1,000. You can select how much it is in this area for committing different crimes. Or you can say use defaults, which will just put the game's defaults. As you can see, it's filled them in automatically for you, or you can be creative. So arrest and attack on sight, well, it's a lot of it's self-explanatory. It's like, are they just going to attack you, or are they going to give you a chance to surrender? Shared crime faction list, this is probably to link it to another crime faction. So you could perform crimes here, but then it would probably use specific data off this one that it's linked with. Do not report crimes against members. That means if somebody in your own faction commits a crime, then you wouldn't report it, or other NPCs that are linked with them won't report it. So you're in sort of the gang. If somebody commits a crime in the gang, you're not going to tell on them, they're your friend. And then you've got ignore crimes against non-members. So if a faction sees what somebody that isn't in their faction is committing a crime, you can tell them to ignore it. So say if they see a murder, if they're part of a gang that just doesn't care what other people do, then they could probably ignore specific things. They could ignore murder or assault, or maybe if they didn't mind people stealing but they didn't like to see people getting murdered, they'd report murder crimes, but they wouldn't report stealing because you've clicked it. So anything you click here, they're just going to ignore, basically. Anyone in this faction is going to ignore this, which is committed by anyone who's not in their faction. And vendor, well, this is all explained in my merchants tutorial, but I'll just quickly go over it. It's just starting and end hours of setting up merchants, selecting the container where they buy, sell their items. Only buying stolen goods can set them up as like a fence so that they can buy and sell all the stuff that you've stolen, obviously. Vendor lists, what sort of stuff they're going to sort of sell you, not sell or buy, that will negate it. So it'll go, anything in this list they will sort of they'll not sell or buy anything from the list selected here. Vendor conditions, if you want to restrict them from selling under specific conditions, say if it's raining I'm not going to sell you anything, or if you are part of a specific faction I don't want to talk to you. And then you've got the location, it's sort of near self usually, or you can say they have to be in a specific location to sell things. So factions do a lot more than you think they do, and they can be quite confusing, but if you just mess around with them and add them and remove them to NPCs, and you can see what happens. They can end up with new dialogue, they can end up reacting differently with other NPCs, and it could be quite possible that they might even start a conversation with other people in their faction. So that's pretty much the rundown of what I know about factions and how they work. Hopefully that gives you a bit more of an idea so they're not so confusing. That should just explain to you why you're putting a whole list of factions onto actors. So I mean, if you want to add a faction to an actor, you just click on them and you go into factions, alternate click new. As you can see, there's loads of factions here. Just to finish it off, I suppose this is a good idea just to show you an example. They're in the crime faction pale, and you also have to assign that there, because if you've got multiple crime factions you have to know which one's their primary one. Excuse me. And you've got the job lumbermill faction. This is probably going to give them dialogue related to lumbermill and make sure they know what they're doing with it. Potential marriage faction, that's another one. They're linked with marriages so that the dialogue appears for that, the dialogue option. And there's a few other things. So this could be quests as well. They're usually heavily linked with quests for favours and things. So it's really cool. Mess around with it, see what you can do. Even what I would always recommend is check out what other actors have. So maybe go to an innkeeper, see what factions they've got, and they've got specific factions for allowing you to sell wood to them, and try it out. See what happens. Add things in there and see what dialogue they end up with, because that's the really interesting one, is dialogue that gets pulled off factions. So I hope you found this tutorial helpful. Please leave comments, let me know what you think. Hit that like and subscribe button if you haven't already. Check out my website, all the usual, my antisocial websites. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll speak to you next time.